Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my very pleasant task to introduce Cathy Davidson to you. I don't think we could have found a more perfect person to provide the opening keynote address to this particular session, or indeed this particular conference. Not only is she a distinguished scholar in her own right, and most impressive in her output, I might say, but she's also astonishing in her range of output and the various matters in which she has engaged. She recognized very early on in her academic career that problems in the real world are seldom so kind as to divide themselves into disciplines, and she has embraced interdisciplinarity. She said she's probably the only, or she is the only Vice Provost of Interdisciplinary Studies at Duke. I would go so far as to say you're probably the only Vice Provost of Interdisciplinary Studies in the whole world.
It was the first one. Yes. We now know it was the first one, but there are now many others.
Oh, I'm pleased to hear that. I haven't heard of too many, that's for sure. So apart from her interdisciplinary outlook and the variety of subjects that she's embraced and pulled together, she's also done that in schools, in universities, in the workplace, and in everyday life. So here's a person from the real world who's been there, done that, made it happen. My great pleasure to introduce to you Cathy Davidson. Over to you.
I've recently moved from Duke University, which is a very elite private university, to the City University of New York, where I teach at the Graduate Center, which is the largest public urban university in the United States. There's 500,000 part and full-time students. 60% of our students attend tuition-free through a variety of grants and so forth. And unlike most American universities where you leave with huge tuition debt, 80% of CUNY graduates leave without a penny of tuition debt. It's an entirely different world for me. I'm actually not going to be talking about it. I'm going to be talking more generally today, but if you're interested in the question and answer period, I'm happy to talk about the new programs. We're just getting started. I've only been there since the beginning of September. Programs were just getting started for this massive public university. Today I'm going to do a little history and a little present, almost no future. And I'm basically going to make 4 different kinds of points, or 4 points undergird everything I'm going to say today. The first being that K through 12 cannot change until higher education changes. Often when we talk about education reform, we think we have to start with kindergarten. There's no middle-class parent that's going to mess up their kid's future. So until we change the rules by which kids get admitted to university, judged by the subject matter of university, judged by the curriculum of the university, K through 12 is going to be very difficult for K through 12 to change its curriculum. So I think the responsibility, I think higher education has shirked its social responsibility in not changing itself, being so reluctant and stuck at changing, which I think deforms the whole system. I would go even further to say in the United States, the top 10 elite universities, which only teach 0.03% of all college students, really set the curriculum for all other universities, K through 12, even nursery school ideas of what education is. That's insane. Forget the top 1%, it's the top 0.03% that has a tremendous impact and has since the 19th century. I'll talk a little bit about that as well. 2, I don't think you can integrate STEM from the human and social subjects. We live in a world where technology is so complex and interacts with every aspect of our lives that we also have to learn how to, all the ways of critical thinking through, with, and about technology, not just technology itself. And that's borne out in all the statistics in the workplace, all of which I could trot out for you if you're interested in the question and answer period. 3, I personally am not really passionate about higher education. Somebody on the plane coming over from London, I was at London this week, said, oh, you must be passionate about higher education reform. I said, actually, I'm not. I'm passionate about unleashing human potential at every level. Right now, this is my argument, we are in an educational system where college is about credentialing the acquisition of somebody else's idea of what knowledge is. It's the opposite, the diametrical opposite of allowing students to find what they do best, what they love, what they can contribute to, which we know from all the research is the single most important predictor of lifelong success. We have the opposite system. We have a system that funnels and fits, not that expands and seeks. So everything I'm talking about today is going to be how we got to this system, why we got to the system, and why it doesn't work anymore, and why we have to change it. Fourth, institutional change is slow, so many of the things I talk about in the last part of my talk are things you can do tomorrow in your life and in the classroom. I've been doing these in renegade fashions my entire career. I thought I've only been doing it since the internet was invented, and I gave a talk last week in Dallas at the Professional Development Conference, and this person came up and I said, "You look familiar." He said, "I do? You taught me 30 years ago." And it was a student in the class I taught 30 years ago where the students remade the town brochures for the town of Wilmington, North Carolina, to put in the famous race riots in Wilmington, which were white people destroying the African-American newspaper and town council in the years after the Civil War. And I do remember that assignment. The students did archival work, wrote new brochures, went to Wilmington and convinced the council to include this alternative version of history. That's the kind of interactive, public, integrated learning I very much champion, and that was done in the context of a required American literature course. So I think there's much we can do creatively now, even as we're waiting for institutions to change. Thank you. I don't know what we would do without you. But, we need to go back. No, there. So can everybody hear me? Yes. Yes. So you also have a little note card and a pencil. That's both because we're trying to do a global educational project, and this will give you our contact information so you can join us. But it's also because we're going to be doing two little very, very quick and easy interactive exercises with this great technology called machine-made paper and machine-made pencils. So those are going to come up. They're like 90 seconds each, very quick in the middle of this talk. So how do we learn at the pace of change? I mean, that to me is the most important thing, not just in higher education, but from birth until death, right? In a changing world, how do you adapt? How do you learn to learn? We often assume that learning is obvious and predictable. It's not. It's very, very difficult. If any of you have ever been in a major change, I've just moved from Durham, North Carolina to New York City. I'm incompetent at everything. Things I thought I knew how to do, I can't do because I'm so concentrating on this entirely tumultuous new way of life that I'm living. Learning new habits means understanding yourself well enough to get rid of habits, to do what Alvin Toffler calls unlearning, systematically figuring out what's holding you back in order to learn. So I'm going to be talking a lot about learning at the pace of change. In the history of technology, it's very rare to have one day that changes everything. My day for when our lives all changed is April 22nd, 1993. It was a very technical, boring day. The scientists at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications at the University of Illinois decided on that day to take the Mosaic 1.0 browser that they'd been using and developing for 20 years and to release the licensing. How could it be more prosaic? To change the licensing of that browser so that anybody with access to an internet with access to a computer could join the internet easily and quickly. Between April 22nd, 1993 and the end of 1993, internet usage increased by 250,000%. Nobody that I've ever met or talked to has been able to come up with a more rapid global change than this one in human history, right? 250,000%. For me, the difference between April 21st, 1993 and April 22nd, 1993 was suddenly anyone with an internet connection who had any idea whatsoever could publish that idea to anyone else in the world with an internet connection instantly, without a pause button, without an editor, right? That is a tremendous human opportunity. It's also a tremendous human challenge, right? You can do anything online, communicate it to anybody else. It seems to always stay around or disappear. And there's no central publisher to stop you, right? Except, of course, in censorship, we can all add the buts, right? How has education changed to address a world in which any of us has that power and that vulnerability, right? I mean, Bank of America, Chase Bank, Cisco, Target, all of which have been hacked lately, right? We haven't done a very good job since 1993 in understanding the implications of an open architecture of the World Wide Web. So first question with the machine-made paper and machine-made ink. Quick one. What year was this photo taken? Just, this is 2 seconds. Just write down quickly on your card. I'll be interested to see. What year was this photo taken? Let's see. Who came up? Has everyone done that? Everyone? Who came up with what's the earliest someone came up with? Just shout out a date. If you anyone come up with something before April 22nd, 1993? Okay, one person. What about 1995? Anyone? 2000? 2005? 2014? Yeah, it was taken in 2014. Now, what's interesting is it's plausible. It was hard to find a photo of a lecture room, a college lecture room where someone didn't have an iPhone or a laptop out. But it's plausible that this could have been taken, except for the hair and the clothes perhaps, before 1993 or after 1993. The method of teaching, the method of learning, the lecture method, does it really suit a world where anyone can have an idea and communicate that idea instantly, publicly, to anyone else with an internet connection without a pause button or an editor? Right? I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think this is how you learn in the world we live in now. It is not how you learn any place else except in school. Right? If I have to take a driver's test, like the simplest thing, I don't go listen to a lecture on driver's tests. Right? How do I study for a driver's test? I get the little book, I take the practice test, I get something wrong, I go back, I look at the book again, I might talk to somebody. I don't go to a lecture. It's a terrible way to learn. It's a great way to be inspired. We as humans somehow like group experiences. We're with other people who can inspire us. It's a terrible method for actually learning, for practicing, or to having the ability to have an idea and communicate that idea well, sensibly, productively, creatively to anyone else in the world with an internet connection. Okay. I like this just to remind us to have a little humility about how overwhelming the time we're in. This is Robert Darnton's idea. Darnton is a historian, as was I originally, of the last information age, the third one that I'll be talking about in a second. But Darnton likes to say in all human history, there have only been 4 times as momentous and full of change as now, where information change, the way we communicate to one another changed so hugely that there was no going back. First one, writing in 4000 BC Mesopotamia. Right? Writing takes a long time, not 250,000% growth in the first year. Writing takes a long time. By the time you get to 450 BC, when Socrates is wandering around the academy, right? The Greek alphabet is finally being concretized. It's finally being standardized, right? That's a long progression from 4,000 to 400 BCE. And of course, Socrates hated writing. He hated this new technology of writing. He said it was distracting, it made you shallow, it isolated you from other people, and took the complexity of dialogue and interaction and froze it on something as plebeian, as simple-minded, as stupid, right? Google makes us stupid. Socrates said writing made us stupid, right? Fortunately, had the student named Plato who wrote this down, or we would not know, right, that Socrates thought writing was stupid. Second one, the printing press. In the West, we used to believe it was invented by Gutenberg. We now know it was invented in 9th century, thanks to Wikipedia. It was invented in 9th century China. Then it goes to Korea for a while. Then it comes back to China. Then it goes to what would now be Saudi Arabia for a while. And finally comes to the West during the Reformation. And Gutenberg gets the credit because he printed the books that dominated Western culture. Third one is the one that was my original period, which is mass printing that happens around the turn from the 18th into the 19th century. For the first time in human history, middle class and working class people could afford books. Right? Machine-made printing, steam-powered printing, machine-made paper, machine-made ink, made books available to the masses for the first time in history, and people were freaked out. Right. In the same way that pundits like to say for the first 20 years of the internet that everything was destroyed, our brains were destroyed, thinking was destroyed, everything was destroyed. People in the turn from the 18th into the 19th century were very, very worried that the kinds of books middle class and working class people wanted to read, were willing to buy with their money as serving maids or carpenters, were books about themselves. What? People wanted to read books about themselves? That had to be dangerous. It actually was a little dangerous. One of my first books was called Revolution in the Word, and it was about the printing revolution that happens in the aftermath of the American Revolution. And one of the things I found out was that the exact same printer, his name was Isaiah Thomas, in the exact same month, printed the preamble to the United States Constitution and the preamble to the first American novel, which is a protest against the United States Constitution. It begins with the famous quote from Jane Addams, "Remember the ladies." Why aren't there ladies in the Constitution? Why aren't there African Americans? Why is there still slavery in the Constitution? Why do you have to property to vote in the Constitution? These are all the issues in the popular novel made possible in the last information age. Our information age, April 22nd, 1993, or any other date, but I like that date just because it so definitively marked the release of the Mosaic 1.0 browser. Now you can think an idea, communicate that idea to anyone else with an internet connection. So second interactive exercise on the index cards. 90 seconds, no more than 90 seconds. Just jot down, there's no right or wrong answers, what you think are the 3 most important changes we could make to the curriculum to help our students prepare for the challenges they face today. 3 main things, and there'll be a second part of this, but 3 main things we could do to change the curriculum for students today, post-1993 students today. 90 seconds. I'd now like you to turn and talk to somebody near you, preferably 2 people, and I want everybody to be able to hear their own voice. So take turns and read your 3 things out loud, and then together figure out what you think is the one most important thing. The end of this will be sharing that one thing with the group. So find somebody to talk to, read your 3 things to each other, and then figure out what you think, and you can combine them and edit them, but come up with one great one. If I'm able to, I'll collect everybody's and put them in a Google Doc so the world can see our ideas, our best ideas about changing the curriculum. Just 90 seconds, quick. Okay, we'll come back to this at the end of the talk, and I would love to collect the index cards and be able to put those in a Google Doc so we could see what everybody contributes. But I just want to make a couple of points. One, you never ever in a situation like this where I'm in front and I've got the pointer and I've got the PowerPoint and I've got the mic have to tell people when you first hand out the cards and ask them to write something to do it silently and alone. Never. And people always do. The first time I taught in Japan in 1980, the first time I gave my students a quiz, a pop quiz, they turned to each other and started talking. I was teaching at the most prestigious women's college in Japan. It was an exchange with the university I was at, Michigan State. And I said, whoa, this is a quiz. You're not allowed to talk to each other. You're cheating. And they were mortified. I actually didn't say they were cheating. That would have been, I knew enough to know that would have been cruel. But I said, let's stop here. Tell me what happened. Because in America, if I told my students we were having a quiz, they wouldn't turn to each other to talk. And they told me that from first grade on, in Japan, kids were put into Han, or group. And your group was chosen by who could contribute something spectacular to the group. Never about disability. So a kid who loved math, their job in the Han was to always be the one who could really contribute the best stuff on math. And the kid who was great at art and loved art would always contribute what was great about art. And when you had a really difficult problem, you always had some partners that you knew could help you to come up with the best solution to a real-world problem, because you had this posse, this group, where everybody was in the group because of all the things they could contribute. When I asked them about learning disabilities, and in 1980 learning disabilities wasn't even that usual in the US, although I'd already at that point, retrospectively, I got my PhD very young, like at 23, and then I found out at 27 I was dyslexic, which was a wonderful way to find out those things. They didn't quite know what that was, what a learning disability was. And I had to really, they would ask me questions more deeply and deeply to try to get at what we thought a learning disability was. And they said, but how could you have a learning disability? You're our teacher. I said, oh, I'm in the top 1% for people with learning disabilities. I'm really bad. I'm just totally dyslexic. And they just couldn't even get the concept. By the second time I taught in Japan in the 1990s, when I gave a quiz, they all wrote silently and alone. Right? And they knew exactly what learning disabilities were, and they all had them. Right? So part of the process is learning that is being taught. And of course, in the Renaissance, you would also have talked to each other. And Socrates wasn't wrong. Right? For Socrates, the only way you learned was in contestation and in dialogue with another mind. And ideally, someone who did not think the way you did. Right? In the dialogues, it's never two people who think alike. There's always one kind of idiotic person and one smarter person. And there's it's usually Socrates, because his student wrote it, right? And so there's always a dialogue back and forth to get to some final point. Okay. So I think a lot of what we need to do to transform education is to get rid of that idea that when you're asked to do a task, you do it silently and alone. And maybe that you do it silently, alone, and on paper, and in some definitive way. Right? Because the other way we do things is there's always a right answer. There's not a process, there's not a mediation, there's a right answer, and kids get that answer right or wrong. That, to me, is exactly the opposite of unleashing human potential. It's exactly the opposite. It's choosing the best answer from 4 available possibilities. So how did we get here? I'm going to do just a quick little history lesson from some new research I'm doing now, as well as some fairly standard research that everybody knows about. The big job of the 19th century, the last information age, machine-made paper, machine-made ink, steam-powered presses, mass-produced books, compulsory publication movement worldwide. The secret weapon, the schoolmarm or the schoolmaster. Do you all know the story of Ichabod Crane, Legend of Sleepy Hollow? Is that a story that's known in Europe at all? It's a parody of the 19th century schoolmaster. He's, very officious. He's always telling everybody how to be exactly right. He's very concerned about keeping the rows exactly straight and everything perfect. His name is Ichabod Crane. If he came into this room, he wouldn't understand this. He wouldn't understand this. He wouldn't understand that. He wouldn't understand lights, but he would know exactly where to stand. He would know exactly where he stood, right? Teacher at the front of the classroom, lecturing to other people, unidirectional, one-directional transmission of knowledge. The idea in the 19th century, school is a verb, to school, to regularize, to train for that world. My argument is, since 1993, this world still exists, and we have to learn more about how this world exists. But a lot of my work world exists on a device small enough to fit in the palm of my hand, right? So, for example, some of the great divisions of the 19th century, let's just say work and leisure, right? Does that exist for anybody anymore, right? If I'm on the vacation on the beach, I can have my work life right there in my hand, right? Same way, I go into my very 19th century office, right? Designed, the office is designed also actually in the first decade of the 20th century. The first modern office is designed. I walk into my office, 19th century office, I close the door to shut out the outside world, and I turn on my computer, right? We live in a world of the 21st century whose architecture, intellectual and physical architecture, was designed for a world of division, standardization, regularization, and compliance, learning how to do what you're told to do when you're told to do it. If I'm a farmer, and I know we have somebody here from one of my favorite places, Alberta, Canada. I'm from Chicago. We didn't have a lot of farms in inner city Chicago, but my first husband was from a ranching family in Mountain View, Alberta. And I know from him that if it's sunny, you do one thing as a rancher. If it's rainy, you do a different thing as a rancher. If it's cold, you do one thing. If it's rainy, it's another. If you think, I've got to fix the barbed wire fence today, and you ride out to your field, and your prize horse or your prize cow is caught up in the barbed wire and bleeding, you not only are an idiot if you tend to fix it to your to-do list and fix the barbed wire before you take care of your horse who's bleeding, you're going to lose your income. You're going to lose your farm. Right? You're constantly making decisions based on the urgency of situations. That's the exact opposite of this world. And schooling is partly a schooling to time, to taking orders, to regulation, to standardizing, in order to go from the world of the farm and individual decision-making to the world of the factory. The great scientist of the 19th century labor, he invented what was called scientific labor management, was Frederick Winslow Taylor. Taylorism is about assembly line labor. And this is a great quote. There's thousands of them. It is only through enforced standardization of methods, enforced adoption of the best implements and working conditions, enforced cooperation that faster work can be assured, and the duty of enforcing the adoption of standards and enforcing this cooperation rests with management alone. Right? It sounds scary. In my last book, I thought I was a genius because I said, wow, our educational system took scientific labor management and turned it into scientific learning management. Then I gave a talk at Dartmouth, and someone said, yeah, that's true. I said, yes, it's true. They said, no, it's true. I said, what do you mean it's true? They said, we had the first school of business in the world, and our first professor who came from the business world to teach academics how to change scientific labor management into scientific learning management was, guess who? Frederick Winslow Taylor. I've never seen that in the literature. I've now been doing archival research. He was corresponding with everybody in the 19th and early 20th century who was creating the architecture of the university we live in now. Okay? My next slide is one of those PowerPoint slides they tell you never to use. I have a good time with it because anytime I find some other scientific learning management tool that Frederick Winslow Taylor had his hand in, that he was advising people on, I stick it on the slide. Here we go. This is mostly the US, but it's also worldwide. Mandatory public secondary schooling, K through 12 curriculum requirements, land-grant universities, research universities, majors, minors, electives, division, certification, graduate school, collegiate law school, nursing school, graduate school of education, collegiate business school, degree requirements, credit hours, grades, statistics, standard deviation, spreadsheets, blueprints, return on equity, punch clocks, IQ tests, giftedness, learning disabilities, multiple choice tests, college entrance exam, multiple choice college entrance exams, American Association of American Universities, tenure, sabbaticals, faculty pensions, school rankings, adolescence, the invention of the term adolescence, and from there you can go on to 1,000 more things, where you have the labeling of infancy, the labeling of the toddler, the labeling of the adolescent, the child, the labeling of the adolescent, and the labeling of the adult. Penal system, educational system, work system, unionization, all of it goes along together. And it's very much part of the 19th century idea. So when I find educators who are fighting for tradition, I think it's very important to remind them that at this time period, it happens earlier in Europe with the Humboldtian University and the division of the Humboldtian University. And the creation of, in each country, it's a little different. But the siloing of different kinds of vocational versus general education. But many of these features go from the US straight to Europe, certainly standardized testing. And my favorite one, grades, and that's why it's in blue, just because it's so crazy. The first institution of higher education in the world to go from written out comments to an A, B, C, D, F grade is a women's college, a very elite women's college that wanted its students to be modern, Mount Holyoke College. I've read the archives from that time. I'm a historian by training, cultural historian by training. And the big argument at Mount Holyoke is, my goodness, if we have A, B, C, D, E, people will, and someone gets an E, people will think it means excellent instead of failure. So they had a big debate about how to get rid of the E and make it A, B, C, D, F. The second organization, 6 months later, to think it might be a good idea to get rid of handwritten comments is the American Meat Packers Association. So I've gone back and read the archives of the meetings of the American Meat Packers Association from 1897, where the American Meat Packers are deciding whether they really do want to get rid of A, B, C, D, F grading, rid of handwritten marks on the meat and go to A, B, C, D, F grading. And what are they arguing about? They don't care about the E. They keep saying, how could something as complex, how could something as complicated as sirloin and chuck, different grades of meat, be reduced to something so simple as an A, B, C, D, F grade? Right? And they vote that it should not be. So to this day, I just within the last 2 months met with some people from the equivalent of the American Meat Packers Association. They said, oh, that's still the case. Every piece of meat that goes that gets a certification in the United States has an A, B, C, D, F grade, but you can go back and find what we would now call the metadata and find out who gave the grade. It's like badging. Who gave the grade, under what circumstances, and what conditions, and what the criteria were. Right? So anyone who says we can't get rid of grades or numerical points or numerical grades because it's too complicated and there won't be a way of judging should look at the American Meat Packers Association, because they've been doing it since 1896, where the metadata for the grade travels with every single piece of meat that's been judged by the American. That's kind of amazing. Meanwhile, grades, sometimes numerical, sometimes A, B, C, D, F, go like wildfire throughout the educational systems of the world. So I'm interested in how traditional education fits into this information mix. And I'm now going to switch from complaining about the past and the system we inherited to 7 ideas that I think could transform any kind of learning, preschool to death, and even our individual lives. These are all big, big principles, kind of vague. And I'm going to try to give an example of somebody I know today who is doing this successfully in their classes. And I'm sure that in this group, I'm positive in this group, you will have hundreds of more examples. But how we could rethink about changing the curriculum if we stopped thinking about subjects and start thinking about solving problems in the world. How we could reform the curriculum if we stopped thinking about majors and start thinking about mission in the world. If we stopped thinking about how we meet requirements and we start thinking about the huge amount of requirements in a world where anyone who has an idea can communicate that idea to anyone else with an internet connection without a pause button or an editor, right? Or even with a way of understanding the world we live in. Right? In the US, you all have read this horrific thing of the policeman who shot a young unarmed man in Ferguson, and the grand jury said he didn't even need to go to trial. The policeman didn't need to go to trial. And the Ku Klux Klan started, which is, of course, a white supremacist organization, started releasing all of this horrible white supremacist organization. Anonymous, the internet group Anonymous, found all this personal information, including credit cards, social security numbers, of the hidden Ku Klux Klan who came out with their masks and published it on the internet, right? Okay. That's kind of great as vindication, but think about that. It turns out I did not know that somebody, and I'm going to be careful about his identity, who works for me, said, oh, that's not hard, and was able to show me that he could have access to any information of any of the people we worked with, right? This is the world we live in, and we haven't changed our educational system to help us all understand this world. Forget kids. This is our lives. Don't you all feel a little vulnerable right now, right? Why haven't we made this change? There's an urgency. There's an urgency. There's a demand. I agree with you completely, Emma. We have to change, not just for jobs, which is certainly huge, but for living in the world we live in. The internet's not going to go away. We have to change. So here are my 7 principles. I know there were 77 more in this room. Here are my 7. Part 3, changing the curriculum. 1, practice digital literacy. In the New York Times, they said I abolished the term paper. I did not abolish. People still do term papers. I've not abolished the term paper, but I don't ever have term papers in my classes. My students, for a final project, have to do a public contribution to knowledge. I tend to do that in every class I teach, whether it's the Survey of American Literature or This Is Your Brain on the Internet, which is a half cognitive psychology class, half technology development class, where my students are engineers as well as scientists. As well as computer scientists. But they have to find a problem, they have to solve it together, and they have to publicly, in open source, display their solution. The organization I co-founded and I've been running since 2002, Haystack, which is a long acronym, HASTAC is how it's spelled, is an open website that has no published, we don't make content for it. It's all user-generated content. So I use the Haystack website, as do about 200 classes around the world, where my students can publicly publish the results of their work. In publishing their work, they have to make a user agreement. They have to deal with intellectual property. They have to deal with data. They have to deal with their issues of identity. Right? I have them write their own user agreements for their website, and then I have them read those things that none of us reads, those 77-page documents we all click in order to go on to the next thing. There's interesting stuff in those. And when my students write their own user agreements, they realize what's obscured by those 77 pages of legalese. Right? 2, think critically, contribute creatively. Critical thinking is fantastic. We have to teach our students to think critically. But if you end with critical thinking, it's very hard then to contribute anything in the world. My students are geniuses at telling me what's wrong with somebody else's ideas. But they have a kind of paralysis when it comes to making their own ideas. So every class I teach now, There's always some progression where we think of an idea and then we actually do something with it. So this is a friend of mine, Ann Balsamo, one of the founders of Haystack. She's also one of the founders of an online women and technology network called FemTechNet. Some of you may know about it. I'm happy to tweet that out so you can see the hashtags and the resources for both. Both of them are open. You can join them. She was teaching a class about AIDS and the AIDS crisis in the 80s. And somebody said, what happened to that AIDS quilt? Remember how people were making quilts to honor people who died of AIDS? Turns out they found the quilt. It's in storage in many places in Atlanta. It is the largest human-made object on the planet except for the Great Wall of China. Also, everybody made their own quilts, so there's no way to preserve it. You do something to preserve one square, or even within one square, there are materials that are actually disintegrating one another. So she's working with the Smithsonian and an army of students at many universities to repatriate the quilts. They're finding, this is history, they have to find out where the quilts are from. It's science, they find out what each square is made of. They repatriate it back to the city it was made in, with instructions for how to archive it if someone wants to archive it. They also digitize it, and they include all the records, the metadata, in a digital visual archive of the quilt. So you can either see all of the quilt or you can connect to it. It's also open source so people can continue to add their stories. The living can continue to add their stories. So she's gone from thinking about an issue to something that's perfect for, it's completely about STEM. It's a real world problem, but it's also about the history of AIDS. It's about gay and laws against homosexuals and the changing mores. She's teaching students where many of the states in the United States now allow gay marriage, right? At a time back when Ronald Reagan, I don't know if you remember this, during the AIDS crisis, when Ronald Reagan first talked about AIDS, he and his staff in announcing AIDS giggled as they were talking about the biggest epidemic in modern history, at least in the Western world, in the affluent world. They giggled 18 times because they couldn't bring themselves to say that it was something that was sexually transmitted. Right? We have changed, our world has changed. So in dealing with this technology, they're also dealing with history. They have fantastic skills too, because all over the world there are problems of preservation and how you digitize material. Privacy, imagine the privacy issues you have to deal with this. Real world problems. The tradition in America has been a revision of the liberal arts tradition. In Europe, there's a much more vocationally focused world, actually of education. New studies of humanities majors are, in fact, there's only about a 0.5 percentage gap between the employability of humanities majors and pure, so-called pure rather than applied science majors. We never hear about that. There is many unemployed mathematicians and far more unemployed computer scientists over the age of 35 than there are people with humanities degrees over the age of 35. Because what most people don't know is, we talked about this at dinner, computer science has programmers has one of the highest burnout rates of any professions. In fact, the top 3 professions for burnout rate are aircraft traffic controllers, simultaneous interpreters. Do we have a simultaneous interpreter here? Who's this? Gracias. It's a very tough thing to do cognitively. And people writing code. Not general computer scientists, but people who have to keep up with the almost second by second changes in writing code. Right? Very high burnout rate. Okay. So I think we have to rethink liberal arts, but not in that old stodgy fashion of we're going to read Milton today and we're going to read Newton tomorrow. But to think about how our world has to reintegrate into a new liberal arts curriculum that works across all of the issues that confront us in our world. 4, let students take the lead. I won't go into all of these. These are all various projects by my students. My students now write a class constitution, decide what constitutes A, B, C, D grades, because I'm in that system, and what doesn't. They grade one another. They create the syllabus. And they make some public contribution to knowledge at the end of the class. Needless to say, they always set the bar incomparably higher than I would have ever dreamt. The most amazing, and you can get this book free online, it's had 20,000 downloads, Field Notes to 21st Century Literacies. I had to miss a class for a conference. My students met in my absence. I came back, they said, we tore up our contracts, we tore up our constitution. We want to do something else. I was like, well, wow, what do you want to do? They said, we want to write a book. I said, what do you mean? They said, we believe so much in peer learning that we want to write a book on how you do it, the details of how you create a peer learning class. And we've written a new contract. The new contract is if we don't hand in a completed book manuscript, where each one of us, there were 8 students in the class, have written a chapter that's been thoroughly proofread and vetted by the other 8 students, a publishable book draft by final exam time, we all fail the class. I would never, as a professor, do something like that. That was, to make a whole class. But I said, well, okay, I will accept that on the provision that I can change it if somebody fails. They didn't fail. We hired a professional copy editor just to make the styles right. We handed it, the designer was an MFA student, a fine art student in the class who designed a beautiful book. And as I said, it's been published on GitHub. It's published on haystack.org, on GitHub, on a commercial site called Rap Genius that allows you to annotate. It was designed to annotate rap lyrics, but you can also annotate field notes to 21st century literacies. On GitHub and as a Google Doc that anyone can contribute to. They're all open source, all available. The one on Haystack has, as I said, been downloaded over 20,000 times. It's been used in, I think, 10 classes, produced by students who led the way and created the assignment. 5, value what we count. This is a very old cartoon. I've never been able to find the origins of it. For a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. Right? I think our idea of standardized testing is appalling. It's appalling. I've, for the last 3 years, been working on badging systems as a more peer-generated way, because I think unless we replace the system with something else that can be standardized, machine-graded, and comparative, we will never get rid of it. So I don't know if badging is the way, but it gives us one workable model that helps us think about other possibilities. I think it's very hard to think about possibility in a vacuum. So this is an alternative way that forces us to think about this. I'm happy to talk about badging in the questions and answers. 6, manage expectations. I think if we think we're going to change everything tomorrow, we get defeated so easily. And it's just, we have to, as humans, have some joy in our lives. This is an experiment that the primatologist Franz de Waal does with monkeys. I'm not a big animal experimentation person, so we're going to put that aside for now. But I want you to see what happens. Monkeys' second favorite food are cucumbers. And when they do this little task where they return a pebble to the tester, they get a cucumber, but it's only their second favorite food. Their favorite food are grapes, and you'll see what happens. Grapes and cucumbers. Cucumbers are number 2, grapes are number 1.
Is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece he eats. Then she sees the other one.
So he's having them do a task where they have to return a pebble and they get a reward.
So a final experiment that I want to mention to you is our fairness study. Then she sees perfectly fine. The first piece she eats.
I think we can even do it without
this. Well, grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us. That's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does.
So this one is getting a grape. Every time it returns a rock, this one's getting a cucumber.
She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber.
She gets a cucumber. This one's getting a grape for doing the same task. The monkey sees what's happening, tests the rock, maybe something's wrong with the rock, gives it back, is hoping to get a grape, gets a cucumber.
So this is basically the
Okay, we can stop it now. So the reason I like to show that one, I'm sorry it didn't have sound, but it's so human of us to feel pretty disappointed right now because our world has changed hugely. And we used to think, wow, we're doing something, we're doing it well, we deserve the rewards. And I think a lot of us now feel like we're only getting cucumbers, right? I'm working just as hard. In fact, I'm working 10 times harder. I'm doing the same thing I used to do. How come I'm only getting a cucumber? And how come other people seem to be getting the grapes? I think it's really important to have empathy for those people who don't change, because it's hard to change, and a lot of people feel cheated by the world we're living in, and it's really hard to get people who feel cheated to change, right? We know that for our students. If we tell our students they're bad and they're second class, guess what? They do bad second class work. Most of us in life right now are feeling like we're doing bad second class work. So we have a monumental task in front of us to change. And I think empathy for those who can't change is a first step to getting them to change. Contempt that somebody can't change is probably because we feel scared ourselves, and it doesn't work. At the same time, sometimes amazing things happen. And this is my single favorite story of amazing things. I used to live in Durham, North Carolina, in the South. A town very near us was Greensboro, North Carolina, a tiny little town in the middle of nowhere, very impoverished. They started building pharmaceutical companies there, and a contractor there, a local contractor named Dennis Quaintance, was given money to build a luxury hotel. And he was very proud of this until he and his wife started looking at their little twin kids, their toddlers, and saying, wow, what will they think of us when they grow up? And realizing they weren't doing anything for the planet. And Dennis said, what if we not only built a luxury hotel, but what if we built a sustainable luxury hotel? So he got together the 80 people who worked for him on projects. Not one of them had a college degree. Not one of them was an engineer. And he said, what if we try to build a sustainable hotel, bring it in on budget, make it beautiful, make it luxurious. But what if we go online and see what we can learn about sustainable building? And they did it very simply. They would have people send them toilets and use he said his kids called it Toilet of the Month Club. They would try out the toilet and see if it worked and see if it would work for the hotel. At some point, the people who give out awards for in the environment, they're called LEAD Awards, Leadership in Environmental Excellence and, we'll say, Design. I can't remember what the D stands for. And they found out they were on the road to building the world's only platinum level, top level, sustainable hotel. Just by learning together and doing it. When I talked to Dennis, I said, that's amazing. What are the lessons from this? He said, there's two lessons. One is 80 people from Greensboro, North Carolina made world history. That's pretty cool. The second level is it wasn't that hard. So if we could do it, why isn't everybody else? That to me is the flip side of feeling aggrieved that we can't do it. I mean, why aren't we making this change? We know we have to. Why aren't we? And I think we can because it's all on our cart. So thank you very, very much. I don't know if there's time for question and answers. If there is, happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much.
Well, questions? I'm also dumbfounded that you can't imagine this.
Yes.
You mentioned something earlier which I found fascinating, with the idea that K through 12 can't change.
Speak a little louder so everybody can hear.
K through 12 can't change unless higher education changes. I mean, is that really the case? I mean, could it change another way? What I mean by, for example, I was at a think tank about a year ago in Canada called Learning 2030, and we ended up with a blueprint which said remove assessment entirely from high school education. And I wonder whether a move like that, of course, it affects the business model of many universities, which is centered around degrees and so forth.
Exactly.
But it did put the sort of the onus on those things back to higher ed. I just wondered whether there was another way. I mean, I guess what I'm coming to is the disruption of higher education from the grassroots rather than from above.
Right. Well, I think it has to be. I think higher education must be disrupted from the grassroots. But higher education has to take responsibility for the stuff that it's a gatekeeper. And of course there can be change. I mean, my dean was always having to talk to the New York Times about some crazy experiment I was doing, but I knew I was a chaired professor. I thought, what can I lose? I mean, you know, they really can't fire me. I have tenure. That's what tenure's for. And, you know, so I was putting myself out there and doing that within a very structured situation where no one else at my university was doing the kinds of things I'm doing. There's always a possibility for that kind of visionary change. Systemically, systematically, I think it's very hard for other people to change if the goal is to go to college so your kid can get a job and be employable and have a productive life. If college says these are our rules. That's what I meant. So I meant taking seriously and profoundly. It's not an English department saying, oh, we're going to require 2 classes before Beowulf rather than 3 classes before Beowulf. It's really thinking seriously about the world we live in now and how we prepare our students for that world in order that the preparation can be from cradle to grave. Right. So thank you. That was I was stating it boldly because higher education is so irresponsible about seeing its absolutely big rule in the world.
Yeah, it wasn't intended to be critical at all. I mean, I agree with you, but it was this sort of overriding sense. I mean, I'm probably the only person here that doesn't have a university education. In fact, I have no qualifications at all because I was expelled from high school. But I think this overriding idea of schools as a conveyor belt for university, for example, is not necessarily the case.
Absolutely. I totally agree. I am very proud of the fact that I was also kicked out of high school 4 times and was that kid, you know, that all the other parents were terrified of. How I became an educator is a long, crazy, darn story. But I think it's the single most important qualification I have for being an educator is that I was a failure in the system. Yeah.
Which is one of the things that the Open University made possible, of course, was people without any qualifications.
Absolutely.
Being able to come into the university system.
Any
idiot should be able to
Yes,
work one of
please.
these, yeah. You've got one.
Yeah, you said at the start that, actually what I should start with saying is I've thoroughly enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you very
This
much.
was excellent.
One of the things you said at the start was that despite barriers, there is much that educators can do with the present system. And it's the theme I want to develop later on today. One of the things that we've been doing, working directly with teachers, is to enable them to develop workarounds to work around the horrible systems they work with.
Yes.
But some in the government would say that actually to do that is irresponsible. My view is that actually a responsible teacher is someone who takes responsibility for the long-term needs of their students. And if we are just simply implementing techniques and strategies which have been given to us by other people, that is irresponsible,
Yes.
Or at worst, or irresponsible as best. Do you have any sort of hints to educators, to practitioners, about how they might work around the system?
Yeah, I think workaround is exactly right. And I think one thing I like to do, I now am teaching future teachers, and one of the things I like to do is have my students do an institutional assessment of what the rules are so they can work around them. Because I think you can get yourself in big trouble if you don't know what the push points and the fault lines are. Like, I can do crazy things because I've reached a certain status and I have security. A new teacher does not, right? So figuring out what the fault lines are, and then I didn't in this one of my other, if I do 10 rules, one of my rules is make alliances with other change makers, and hopefully powerful ones. So I think those of us who have some authority in the world have to be shields for other people, right? I try not to write any new tenure letters for anybody who I don't already have a commitment to, and I've devoted my time to being a shield for people in trouble who have done something remarkable and amazing and are getting in trouble for it. And then I make those public because I think it's very, very, very important that those people not be models in a bad way, but be models in a good way. But I think how you do a workaround is completely situational. There's no one blueprint, except remembering responsibility. I know I work a lot with K through 12 teachers, and I know a lot of teachers who, and I've heard this so many times I now believe it, who say they first used to think that when they did after school projects for their students, that was double work. They now know that it makes them feel so much less cynical about what they do in the classroom that it actually has made their lives livable. Whereas just preparing for exams every year. The United States tests earlier and more often than any other country on the planet. Most people don't know that. And there's always having to, what I hear from especially 6th grade teachers since middle school is, that's like 12-year-olds, is so important to future development. Parents, kids, teachers all get sick before the end of the year exam. I had a principal tell me this and said, actually, I'm not feeling well right now. They're all enforcing a sick system that makes them sick. So the teachers I know who are doing, sometimes 3 or 4 teachers will get together after school and do this is what you really need to learn. That's voluntary and extra. It is extra work, but somehow it's life enhancing. And I do think that the things that kill our spirit are far worse than working too hard in the long run. But that's not a justification. I'm so opposed to so much of the present system right now. But workaround is exactly the right word. And again, workaround, you have to be cagey institutionally. Who are your friends that have power that you can go to and say, I just want you to know I'm doing this. In case you get any complaints, here's what I'm doing and here's how I'm set up. Documentation. My syllabus, when I'm having students do all this, is longer and more complicated and more, I'm thinking of all kinds of bad words, more pedantic in its language than anything I used to do when I was a more traditional teacher, because I want everybody who uses my method to be able to copy my syllabus, it's always public, and show it to their people and say, look at this methodology. And I have lots of footnotes and all of that in order to give that, to be the shield to allow for that workaround. But sadly, we live in a world of workarounds, right? I think if I were the kid I was now, I'd be in juvenile detention or, somewhere. Life is harder now in the sense that we're, at least in the U.S., far more punitive to young people than we used to be. Far more punitive to young people. I had an admissions counselor who said, you're smart, even though you kind of are living on the streets. It's much, much harder. There are far less options now, especially if you're black, especially if you're poor, especially if you're male in the United States. That's documentable. The prison industrial complex is appalling.
It's interesting to think about workarounds when you think of maybe bottom-up, sort of bottom-up. But if you come into an institution as a leader and try to change an institution, which I've tried to do twice, with some effect, not as much effect as I would have liked, your main resistance is the staff on the ground.
Wow, totally.
So, in a way, we're doing it to ourselves.
Yeah.
And I had to find people like you and publicly support them.
Yes.
Because I had to send a message that those were the people that I liked and those were the people I would support. But the system, the unions, the dean's officers, they were implacably against changing the system.
And sadly, it's often the faculty themselves.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, not even people with power, not even old versus young, faculty themselves. Like, this is what I was schooled to do. This is what I'm meant to do. How dare you change it? And again, how you find those people and reward them is the flip side of that.
So
That's
it's not
really
only
important.
from the time. I'm eating into your coffee break because I think this is more important than your coffee. So you're just going to have to put up with the fact that you're going to have to gulp down your coffee. There's several questions. There's one at the back that's been very patient, and there's yes.
Thanks for your talk. Very good. Thanks. Two comments. One, the workaround, and the other one, how to enable change. My background is in design, part of it industrial design. Back in Australia, where I come from, basically we were involved in innovation and creating new things. The big challenge is how do you teach it at uni? I'm not a born and bred academic. I was brought from the corporate arena to teaching. My experience is that, yes, bottom-up is going to happen, and is happening at the moment. But also the industry is finding a very good workaround. In my case, I had the privilege to work with a few cutting-edge companies in the past. And they decide that sending their staff to university, it basically takes them back a few years, average 25 to 30 years. So they develop their own universities internally. The big challenge for us would be how to work around with the new generations and be smart enough to actually break the silo mentalities within the university or higher education, and that is where the challenge is. So I would like to ask about experiences of anybody here about what is the technique about to break that wall. I would like to offer one possibility. You offered the idea of cradle to grave. In my case, I would like to come with a perspective from design, which is cradle to cradle, and maybe using maybe using the internet as the collective memory that can actually help not just recycle, but reinvigorating the common knowledge and the memory, collective knowledge of the group.
That's great. I've never heard cradle to cradle before. That's brilliant.
Yeah.
Yes, very, very
so
important.
we keep a sustainable approach to business of education, the same like in the corporate arena, but also a sustainable approach that comes from the thinkers of climate change and sustainability in that case.
Very, very good. Literally cradle to cradle, the president of Chile has put in a new, phenomenal new policy of education which requires maternal literacy and education along with infant care as part of infant care. That is the best investment you could make in your society right now. How brilliant is that? Yes, cradle to cradle. Thank you. I will never forget that. Thank you. Great.
So, it's Madam Sewell.
Yes, a question about pre-service education, and often it is said that's a huge barrier to education because we teachers teach the way they were taught, and ways that we can change that.
Right. I mean, I do lots of workshops for teachers, both college teachers and K through 12, and I attend them all the time because I can get stuck in a rut as fast as anybody else. And I have lots of methods that I use to help people be aware of what they contribute and how they contribute and how to do things differently. I think most people, if they feel comfortable doing something else and succeed at it, actually like to learn new things. But the process of getting there is often done in these brutal situations that replicate exactly the situation you're going to change. One of the methods I do in every class I do, and when I do a lot of work in the corporate world, when I do change, programs on change for corporate leaders, is I hand out 6 Post-it notes. I love high technology, index cards, Post-it notes. By the way, I would like to collect those cards because I really would like to make a Google Doc with the ideas that people came up with for curricular change. I'll do that tonight when I go back to my hotel. But on the Post-its, on one-colored Post-its, I ask people to add something they think they can add to our class, whatever the class is, that doesn't seem logical. And I always give the example of comics, because if you've got somebody who can do virtual diaries or mind mapping, that is precious. And some people just have that skill, or multiple languages, or I can code. And then on the other three things that people are afraid they're not going to be able to accomplish and they need some help with. And then I have everybody put the 3 Post-it notes of the things they cannot do on the board with spacing, and have everybody, and this I learned from the CEO of Cisco, have everyone, this part, go around and silently, no talking, read all of the things people cannot do in the classroom or in the organization. It's a very humbling thing, because one thing about our educational system is you learn to fake it. And when you see everybody else has the same anxieties about learning that you do, or different ones, or you say, wow, I can't do that either, but I can do these. It both gives you confidence and empathy in an incredible way. The second assignment is you take the things you can do and you put them and match them with people who can't do them, and you make learning partners for the learning. And it never quite works, and so I've now done this maybe, 100 or 200 times. I then say, so we've got some empty spaces and some duplications there. Can you straighten it out? And I leave, and people do. They want to have these learning partners. So then if it's a week-long session, I always schedule some part of the day where learning partners can get together and exchange knowledge and work together. It makes a huge difference because everybody feels like they're not only a learner, but in the situation where they're most insecure as a learner, they're also a teacher. And we know there's no way to learn better than by teaching. So it structures. And I'm a big believer in not only in workarounds, but structuring opportunities to find your own best assets. Right? Because in this kind of situation, it's very hard to find your own best assets. Right? So I like to give practical advice, but actually do stuff where I don't have to say every teacher is a learner, every learner is a teacher. They're doing it, and that's how they get through the class. And then I always look at those notes and see some things and make sure there's things so that everybody gets to do a teacher, because I'll put a challenge in that requires learning HTML, for example. So then there'll be somebody who gets to teach that skill. Or everybody has to draw a comic. So then the person who knows how can get to be the expert in a situation. Often the person who can do mind mapping is very poor at other things and genius at that. And it's such for me, it's like a magical skill. I tweeted about this last night. There's somebody named Julia Forsyth who does a lot of mind mapping at a distance for events like this. And she's just a genius at it. And how she does that, how this gentleman doing simultaneously does what he does. We can all learn from that because it's such an extraordinary and useful skill.
And they won't get Alzheimer's either, apparently. It's you reduce your chance of Alzheimer's by 100% by doing interpreting. So congratulations. One more question at the back there, and then I'm going to call for coffee. Did you have a question? No, I thought there was a question at the back there. Here's one at the front, Mitchell. And that'll be the last question, I'm afraid. And the rest of the questions can be asked at tea time and coffee time and lunchtime.
And I do want to collect those cards.
It's just a one-line observation. That is, when a system starts to change, an education system starts to change in a certain way, you can get change at this level and change at this level. And I find sometimes it's the middle layers that can be the biggest barrier.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
it's true. It's true. It's true. But one reason I love that crazy slide with all of these things that are happening at once is that happened in a pretty, about in a 50-year period. So we don't have to do it tomorrow. But 50 years is pretty short to think about how monumental those changes are and how much they last. I don't know about the rest of you, but many of those things still run my life, right? And those are actually, many of them are middle-level structures that were structured and changed. So we can do it. But I agree with you completely.
Well, on behalf of all of you, I want to say thank you for a most excellent address. Thank you again. Show your appreciation.